Hi, this is Roger Green, host of the Surfing the Mass Tsunami podcast. This week we are offering 4 conversations from episode 16, our episode Remembering Stephen Harrison with Donna Cryer, Jorn Schattenberg, and Dimitar Tonev. Plus, from Evolve, the last new drug study Stephen ever shared on the podcast, which was last July. This is the second half of my conversation with Dimitar Tonev. It focuses largely on some of the elements of Stephen's personality that made him so unique and such a role model within the community. Dimitar discusses one more innovation Stephen brought to MASLD clinical trials, recruiting in neighborhoods that receive lower levels of medical care, and then within those communities, recruiting within families. I harken back to the recruitment issue to tell a story that Stephen and I started Surfing MASH to educate sponsors and sites about the ability to keep clinical trials running in a site network like Summit even during the pandemic. To Dimitar, one thing that made Stephen special was, and I quote, his enormous capacity to work long hours, to the degree that left Dimitar wondering how this was even humanly possible. He mentions early clinic starts, 4 a.m. text messages, and other related off-hour items that he and Stephen shared. I mentioned a story I heard at the funeral about Stephen telling a friend that he didn't sleep much, but he slept, and I quote, very efficiently, unquote. We agree about the energy and enthusiasm Stephen devoted not only to his work, but to everything he did, his families, his hobbies, building the lake house, etc. Dimitar tells a story about Stephen flying over the Atlantic with his family. It's a great story. You're going to have to listen to learn it. It'll make you laugh. He goes on to discuss Stephen's passion for working on minor diseases that were unlikely ever to pay off in terms of money or prestige, and finally how Stephen boosted Dimitar's self-image by, at a point in time when he was not confident in his own career, Stephen presented a couple of his slides and credited him in a presentation in a major meeting, which made him feel proud and important. I'm simply going to repeat what I said at the end of the episode 14 conversations. Stephen was one of the most unique individuals I've ever had the pleasure to know and work with. These conversations touch on just a small sampling of what made Stephen Stephen. So just sit back, listen, learn, absorb. When you're done, check out and perhaps contribute to the memorial page on our LinkedIn discussion group. We'd love to hear your recollections as well.
Dimitar Tonev.
He was traveling with his portable fibroscan to certain communities where patients with obesity and multiple other risk scores were known to exist, and was offering, his screening services to many of these communities in something we called outreach clinics, which is vaguely similar to something we were doing many decades ago in viral hepatitis, trying to find patients that are not so known to liaise with healthcare system very well. I mean, that's completely different type of patients as compared to Hep C, but definitely some smaller community patients which do not have probably excellent health care in rural Texas. And that's another innovation that I think Stephen utilized very, very successfully, as well as his charm. He was talking about these stories that it's a big family of patients with, Mexican origin, and he will get to know the mom. He will be her treater, and sooner or later there will be more and more family members coming to consult with him about their obesity and fatty liver disease and issues they are having. And many of those patients were indeed in need of certain care related to their livers, and probably a considerable proportion was also a potential patient that would appreciate and will be interested in clinical trials in NASH area.
Roger Green.
So I don't know how much you know about how this podcast actually started, but you're getting pretty close to the heart of it. The podcast started because one of the other benefits of that kind of chain network recruiting is that if you needed to make an adjustment to an IRB, you could create a website, people could connect, and you could pretty quickly come to a consensus about what to do and get approval. Much easier than what would happen to the tertiary care institution. And when the pandemic struck, the COVID pandemic, people couldn't adapt quickly enough to the idea that you had to do biopsy in a place where patients didn't want to be touched and you couldn't give them to hospitals, and nobody knew how to get on top of this pandemic. But Stephen and some of his sites worked out a pretty pragmatic way to do it, and then needed to figure out a way to get that message out. And the initial message of the podcast, and if you go back to episode 1, all that way back, it's Stephen talking about how you can execute trials in the COVID pandemic, given that you've got to do biopsies and patients don't want to be touched. We put together 3 more episodes to buttress that. One about, how the investment community view that kind of thing. What issues does it leave for CEO, and what would a forecaster have to say? And then while we were doing that, we started getting letters from patients saying, tell me about my disease. And we decided we had to keep going. But it originally started exactly the place you're talking about. And with one of the unique benefits, in addition to being able to just recruit a lot more patients, the ability to be nimble to that particular crisis. So I'm intrigued to hear you say that.
His idea, I think, went in this direction direction even before COVID, and probably COVID crystallized this very idea to do clinical research out of tertiary unit and closer to patient homes and sometimes inpatient homes. But he was running ahead of the game even before that, because Summit was created at least, I would say, 5 or 6 years before the pandemic, if not even 10 years before the pandemic. And it was quite an interesting idea. Now, many are trying to replicate this. I don't know with what degree of success, because he is still the ultimate, power in MASH clinical trials. And I sincerely hope that his multiple companies will continue to be extremely helpful and to drive this clinical research forward. Massive contribution in a purely practical direction, because as I said, I'm not intending here to talk about multiple articles that he wrote and how he changed the overall field from a very depressive area when everything was failing to, I believe, a current situation when we have one product on provisional license and probably, hopefully, we'll have few more in the next few years.
Okay, so at the risk of being possibly redundant, you knew Stephen pretty well. What do you think were some of the personality traits about Stephen that enabled him to put that kind of thing together?
He was always able to demonstrate, and I was actually wondering how this is even humanly possible, an enormous capacity to work long hours. And while this ultimately probably was detrimental for his otherwise excellent health, I was hugely surprised that he was able to respond to text messages in 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning. His time was then doing some sports, getting into clinics early, reading manuscripts and returning comments on protocols and papers late in the evening. So he invested an enormous amount of energy and manpower and willpower into this franchise that he was leading. And whether the years in the army was potentially responsible for cultivating this enormous amount of energy and desire and will to deploy all this energy for the greater good of scientific field, he was dedicated, because, as I mentioned, he was not only and was not entirely a NASH key opinion leader. He had also massive amount of work and very successful papers, at least to my knowledge, in the area of viral hepatitis, mostly hepatitis C. So that was not a new phenomenon for me when I saw it, but after his retirement from the army, he had more time probably and a free rein to do things his own way.
You know, it's interesting. I think when you talk about the tremendous energy level and capacity to work on mindful of two things. One, a story that I think it was Katie Wack from Path AI told me as we were on the bus heading over to his burial. She said she doesn't sleep really well. I don't sleep really well. She asked Stephen about it and how many hours of sleep he got, and the answer was some ridiculously low number. And she asked how that worked, and he said, well, I sleep very efficiently. Now, at the end of the day, I'm not sure it worked out that way, but I thought the optimistic point of view and the belief that you could master sleep so that you could get less and still just keep rolling was very, very Stephen kind of thing.
He was, I believe, adding at least few extra hours to what other very active human beings will consider a very long working day. So he was adding 2, 3, 4 hours to the daylight. And that was probably the secret of how he was able to accomplish so much.
You know, but it wasn't just the work. I mean, he was that passionate about building his lake house. He would disappear. I remember one year he disappeared from ASLD for 36 hours because he promised he would take Anna Lauren to a concert. So he flew back to Texas, took her to the concert, turned around and flew back. He was that passionate about his family. He was that passionate, as I say. I remember when he was building the lake house and he would tell me every week about what was going on. I mentioned this on the podcast with Manal because this was a Manal thing. Every time we had Manal on, she would be in a different room in her house and Stephen would comment on the room and remember how it was different from the other rooms he'd seen before. He had a remarkable capacity for retaining tons of different information in different kinds and thinking visually. And then when you put that with all that energy, what you can get done in the day is pretty compelling. We're collecting Harrisonisms, special Stephen sayings, things people heard Stephen say that really struck them forcefully. Do you have any of those you can recall?
I remember a story which is one of my favorites related to Stephen, and hopefully nobody else have shared the story so far. But so the story goes how Stephen is coming back from, I believe, an ESO in the UK with his family, and they're enjoying the flight, watching telly. And one of his kids was complaining before the flight that the time in Europe was not sufficient. They were enjoying their time so much, so they were a little bit moaning that they're going back to United States. And So it happened that meanwhile the flight attendant passed by asking whether there are medical practitioners on board. And one thing, you know the story?
No.
And one thing led to another. He, of course, immediately volunteered to be the medical practitioner that was needed. There was another passenger in distress with some stomach issues, abdominal discomfort, potential need for, surgery, let's say appendicitis or whatever. So the clinical signs were categorical. So Stephen suggested to the captain to turn around plane and to land at Shannon. They were passing by Ireland at the time, to land in Shannon in order for the patients to be able to receive a very urgent medical care. And he was joking with his kid, the very same that was moaning, because they didn't hear the conversation. They were with earphones. And he was saying, I've heard you being, so regretful that we are leaving. I've arranged for us to come back. And they, of course, didn't believe him. And he said, watch the screen. And that was hugely, impressive how this big plane slowly end up in a big curve going down to Shannon. And his kid was so impressed, was like, Daddy, you've really done it. So he was joking, of course, but look at what sense of humor and likewise, what an impression, what a lasting impression that should have been for his kid.
That's fantastic. Anything else about Stephen you'd like to share with our listeners?
I was very impressed by his honest scientific interest to sometimes smaller diseases, definitely diseases and franchises whereby there will be less so return of investment, whereby his time being his most precious commodity probably won't be utilized so successfully and immediately with loads of uncertainties. And I'll just give you an example. While he was on very, very short supply for all the companies that are developing therapeutics in NASH, he invested enormous amount of time and almost like free of charge to a small Danish biotech company that was trying to develop therapeutics in a completely new pathway, effectively inventing surrogates as they went in decompensated cirrhosis, not necessarily from MASH origin. It's just decompensated cirrhosis regardless of etiology. He provided time, precious advice, connected them with other like-minded people, was a real driver for their clinical development program. And that was just probably done in his free time. Very, very impressive, because you would assume a highly popular and very much needed MASH key opinion leader to stay focused in his main disease. But he was very able and willing to jump around into another, so to say, less important and completely unclear in terms of regulatory pathway disease, just to bring something new to the field. And I think advice provided and results achieved were really very, very good.
Is there one thing you can take forward in your life and in your work going forward, which you can say was like Stephen's special contribution to you?
Personally, he was able to reassure my doubts at a certain point in my career when things were not going really well. I do remember one or two NASH attacks before. I was sitting in the audience and was not in particularly good mood. I don't know how my own clinical studies were progressing at this point in time, but definitely a little bit depressed. And all of a sudden, Stephen quoted me as somebody that a good friend provided him with a couple of slides. And that was so kind. And you could immediately sense how the interest of others in the audience towards you, my humble persona, increased immensely, being quoted by Stephen Harrison from the podium for a slide that was not particularly, important from scientific standpoint, but just put together a couple of studies in an interesting train of thoughts. Hugely grateful for, bringing some of the spotlights that he was always operating under upon me in this particular case. And to a certain extent, allowing me to believe a little bit more, to trust my own kind of efforts will be successful a little bit more, definitely lifting me up.
That's a tremendous story and contribution on which to close this particular conversation. Thank you so much for your time today. And we'll be posting this tomorrow afternoon, actually, Thursday afternoon. Maybe you and I can get a cup of coffee in Milano in a couple of weeks. All right. In fact, I think the first time I ever met you in person was standing in line last year in Vienna. You turned around and introduced yourself. And I said, yeah.
I remember that. And you knew the name, which was a massive compliment for me.
And now, back to Roger.
We hope you've enjoyed this recording. If you have any questions or comments about the content of this conversation or the entire episode, please put them in the review section of the page from which you downloaded this conversation, or send an email to questions@surfingmash.com. Next week, we will preview the EASL Congress 2024 with President Alexander Krag, Jörn Schattenberg, and perhaps some of the other key European KOLs. Until then, stay safe, surf on. We'll see you on the podcast. Bye-bye now.